Yeah, it's working. Good evening. I'm Jean-Pierre Dupuis, and I'm happy to welcome everyone here tonight, especially our speaker, Timothy Snyder. On behalf of Stanford, on behalf of the Department of French and Italian, where I am professor, on behalf of Imitatio, where I'm director of research, and on behalf of our co-sponsors, the Department of History and the Consulate General of France in San Francisco. A quick word about Imitatio, since it might be unfamiliar. Imitatio is a project of the Thiel Foundation, and it is dedicated to the critique and development of René Girard's anthropology. And it is to celebrate René Girard's extraordinary intellectual achievement that we are here tonight. René Girard has elaborated a sweeping anthropology of religion and violence in his daring intellectual career over more than half a century. He was born in France in 1923. He moved to this country in 1947, and he has pursued a unique transatlantic path ever since, publishing more than a dozen books in French, all while teaching at American universities, and most recently Stanford, where he is professor emeritus. Girard's work has been translated around the world. He has been made one of the 40 immortals of the Académie Française, and he was given the Lifetime Scholarly Achievement Award by the Modern Language Association. Gathering together to ask and answer hard questions is a fitting way to celebrate his work, and that is why we have invited Timothy Snyder to be the inaugural René Girard lecturer. He gave his first Conférence René Girard this past October in Paris, and tonight will be the inaugural lecture in California, and future René Girard lectures will continue to bring thinkers to speak in both Paris and Stanford in honor of René Girard. Timothy Snyder is the Hausen Professor of History at Yale University, and he is the author of several books, including Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin, a study of mass murder in Eastern Europe in the 1930s and the 1940s. He is well suited to be the first scholar to deliver a René Girard lecture, not only because of the sweep and power of his research, but because in his quest to understand the history of violence, he warns us against the three intellectual and moral temptations that are also stressed by René Girard. First, we must resist the temptation to explain violence simply as a result of bad ideas and evil doctrines. Girard's anthropology has shown that violence spreads like a contagion, a meaningless mechanism. Snyder's history, meanwhile, tells how people who have collaborated with one regime of occupation were often likely to collaborate with the next, confounding any neat demonology. A second temptation is to denounce the scandalous. Girard has shown how we certify our own superiority by loudly proclaiming others' transcendent guilt. In Bloodlands, Timothy Snyder writes that finding other people to be incomprehensible means abandoning the search for understanding. He points out that dismissing Nazis or Soviets as beyond human concern means falling into their moral trap. A third temptation is to equate the search for justice with simply taking the side of the victim. Girard has shown that aggressors always see themselves as defenders, and Timothy Snyder recounts how the historical perpetrators of mass killings saw themselves as innocent victims. The human capacity for subjective victimhood, he observes, is apparently bottomless. These are just a few of the ideas Timothy Snyder offers in Bloodlands, each of them worth far more than just one lecture of their own, and each of them representing the best kind of research. That is because he marries hard-won empirical knowledge with moral urgency, and he helps to teach us the difference between moral wisdom and mere self-righteousness. Tonight, he will be talking about his most recent work, about bringing his search for understanding to the history of the Holocaust. I forgot to mention that last October in Paris, Timothy Snyder delivered his lectures and held his seminars in French. And everyone there was admirative of his mastery of the language. So let me conclude these few words of welcome by saying, merci beaucoup Tim, d'avoir accepté notre invitation, et bonne chance pour votre conférence.
So I'm resisting the temptation to begin now in French. The joke would be too cheap. I'd like to begin, though, where Jean-Pierre left off, by expressing my own gratitude for this particular honor. To have been chosen to deliver the inaugural lecture is a special kind of pleasure, and it's a special kind of privilege. It's just about the most decent and honorable thing I think one can do in this particular moment in history, to use wealth to support the humanities, which is what's being done here. And there's a special kind of admiration that's involved when a student honors his teacher, which is, of course, what is happening here. There isn't enough of this sort of acknowledgement in our society that I have learned at the feet of someone else, that someone else has taught me things. And of course, it's a special pleasure to be, so to speak, in the middle of this. As a teacher myself, I'm very gratified to find myself in the middle of an expression of gratitude to another teacher. So thank you all the more. The subject that I'm taking up today is a subject that is right in the middle, I think, of humanistic scholarship. It's a subject whose importance could hardly be overstated. The subject is the Jewish Holocaust, the mass murder of European Jews between 1941 and 1945. What I'm seeking to do here, to be clear about this from the very beginning, is to, can't be mine. What I'm seeking to do here, to be clear about this, is not to commemorate, is not to remember, but rather to explain. And there's an important difference between commemoration and explication. They come close to being each other's opposites. When we commemorate something, we are fixing both its place in the past and we're trying to fix the way that we want to think about it. Explanation cannot tolerate either sorts of fixing. It cannot tolerate the fixing in the past. It cannot tolerate the attempt to make permanent the way that we remember anything. Explanation instead can only work if its arguments apply both to the past and to the present. And a historical explanation can only work if it brings an event of the past into our own present understanding, both in the sense in which we can understand it, but also in the sense that it enlightens our present and may give us a hint about what's going to happen in the future, which is where I'm going to try to conclude. Now, I'm going to begin with what might seem like a bold claim. This is a subject that is crying out for explanation. It's crying out for explanation not just because of its inherent importance. I believe this is the central event of the 20th century, at least in the West. I believe it's the event without which one cannot understand the history of Europe, or write the history of Europe, or begin to write the history of Europe. But I also think it's an event whose explanations as yet have not attained the kind of scale or the kind of penetration one would need. After all, if one were to recite the standard reasons that we give for the Holocaust, none of them really can withstand much more than a moment or two of scrutiny. if it was because of the way that the Germans are, then one would also have to accept that the Germans are not just good at being National Socialists, they were also very good at being communists and probably best in the world at being capitalists, right? So an explanation from German nature, or from German history even, tends to fall apart very quickly. The special character of German history, the idea that this was a breakdown in German civilization, which is the most powerful, the most palpable, the most familiar form of explaining the Holocaust. You start with a civilization in full flower, and you watch it decline and fall. That powerful trope of decline and fall, so powerful to all of us who believe that we are part of a civilization. And yet, most of the Holocaust didn't happen in Germany. Most German Jews survived. Most of the perpetrators were not German. The first Jews who were killed had never been touched by German power until the moment when they were killed. And so a story which involves things that happen in Germany can certainly be nothing more than an introduction. We fall back then to the anti-Semitism among the peoples among whom the Jews lived. And to be sure, there was a great deal of anti-Semitism among the peoples among whom the Jews lived. Jews lived for 500 years in Eastern Europe. This was the demographic homeland, leaving political and moral claims aside, the demographic homeland of the Jewish people for half a millennium. And they lived amongst a great deal of anti-Judaic and then modern anti-Semitic feeling. However, to explain, there's so much of it, it's so ubiquitous that it can't really be the explanation, you see. To explain the Holocaust in terms of the local anti-Semitism is like explaining a hurricane by the presence of air. It might be necessary, it's certainly there, but it can't possibly be sufficient. To say that anti-Semitism caused the Holocaust when Jews had lived among people we would call anti-Semites for half a millennium really just asks the question all over again. The simplest kind of answer to the Holocaust is to point to the ideas, to say the ideas of Mein Kampf explain the Holocaust. But frankly, this to me just makes the problem all the more difficult, right? The ideas that are expressed in Mein Kampf, to which we're going to address a good deal of attention tonight, these ideas are preposterous, right? They express a worldview which is preposterous. Moreover, Mein Kampf is one of thousands and thousands and thousands of similarly ridiculous pamphlets that were published in the early 1920s in Germany, right? In Germany and in Europe. The question as to why this particular pamphlet expressed a worldview which was then realized seems to me a very difficult one. To just say, well, these were the ideas of Mein Kampf, therefore the Holocaust, is to ignore the fact that in the early 1920s, many, many people had preposterous worldviews, most of which we've completely forgotten because the huge majority of them were not realized. Even if we know that Hitler was going to be the leader of Germany, it's still not clear how the ideas in Mein Kampf automatically would have produced the Holocaust. I'm going to give you just a couple of simple figures, which I'd ask you to keep in mind as we continue. 97% of the Jews who die in the Holocaust did not speak German and had no connection with German culture and were not German citizens. 97%. The percentage of Jews, the percentage of the population in Germany that was of Jewish origin in 1939 was 1/4%, right? So even if we know that Hitler wrote Mein Kampf, and even if we know that Hitler was the leader of Germany, we are still a long way from explaining how it could be that something like the Holocaust, which involves the murder of nearly 6 million Jews, as I say, almost all of them not German, and all of them beyond Germany for all practical purposes, we're still a long way from understanding how a Holocaust could have happened. Now, I've been unfair in my brevity, but I don't think I've been unfair in the list. These are the major things that come to mind, I think, when one inquires as to why the Holocaust could have happened. So what I'd like to do is begin from Mein Kampf, not as an answer, but rather as a way of posing the question. How could it have been? How could it be, since history is always with us, history are things that continue to happen, how could it be that this particular preposterous worldview was in fact realized in practice? And the way I'm going to divide the argument is to first consider the worldview to make sure we understand what's fundamental about it and what's less fundamental, and then to ask the question of how it could possibly be brought into realization. Now, Mein Kampf, rereading Mein Kampf, rereading the rest of Hitler's, what's left from Hitler, which is Mein Kampf, the so-called second book, his table talk, his conversations with the generals. One can distinguish from this body of work a fundamental level of reasoning. And the fundamental level of reasoning is the planetary, the ecological. The way that Hitler characterizes the Earth is that the Earth is a finite surface with limited fertile soil over which compete and must compete races. The same way that species compete for an ecological niche, human races compete for fertile soil. This is the way the world is, says Hitler, and it's the way the world should be. Indeed, in this very dark view of the world, the only beauty and the only goodness to be had is precisely this struggle. What Hitler sees as a pure struggle of the mighty against the weak, and that the struggle provides the only thing that we have of either aesthetic or ethical goodness. It is the only harmony in the universe. The struggle is the only thing that matters. It's the only thing which is proper and which is true. Now, where do Jews come into this? I hesitate to use the term anti-Semitism here because it seems that anti-Semitism is inadequate for the kind of planetary or ecological or metaphysical description that Hitler applies to the Jews. An anti-Semite can be someone who doesn't want you to join his club. An anti-Semite can also be someone who wants to remove an entire group from the universe. This covers a lot of bandwidth of meaning. Hitler's particular attitudes toward the Jews begin at this level of the planetary, of the ecological. The problem with the Jews is not that they are a worse race. The problem with the Jews, according to Hitler, is also not that they are a better race, although that's a little bit closer to it. The problem with the Jews is that they are not a race in the normal sense of the word. The problem with the Jews is that they refuse to play by the rules of nature. The problem with the Jews is that they will not be satisfied, says Hitler, even if you give them land. So the way the struggle is supposed to work, we all scratch out a bit of territory, we get enough, we defend the borders, and then we're happy. There's a kind of harmony, things are more or less in balance. The problem with the Jews is that even if you give them territory, they're not satisfied. They don't want territory. And what's worse, they've found a way to permanently break the laws of nature. This is what's wrong with the Jews, and this is their special power over everyone else, says Hitler. They found a way to break the laws of nature. The laws of nature are races compete. How can those laws be broken? Those laws are broken by ideas, as Hitler sees things, artificial ideas of solidarity that would cut across one race into another race. What kinds of ideas? Well, on the one hand, communism, right? Communism or socialism includes the idea that working classes around the world have something in common, regardless of what their racial or ethnic or national background might be. That is therefore a Jewish invention. It's a facade for Jewish power, says Hitler. On the other hand, capitalism. Capitalism, and in this way it's like communism, says Hitler, it creates artificial forms of solidarity. Lawyers signing contracts, or businessmen locating labor forces abroad, or anyone carrying out any kind of transaction naturally can't heed just racial differentiation. Even the search for profit involves a kind of solidarity which can't pay attention to ethnic differences, right? Therefore, capitalism is also an invention of the Jews. These are the two major ideas that Jews have brought to us, says Hitler, which prevent us from seeing the way that nature is supposed to work. Now, from this fundamental level of reasoning in Mein Kampf, Hitler draws, or we can draw if we read closely, two basic conclusions, two licenses for action. The first is that what science gives us, it cannot change. Now, we often don't think about Hitler and his views on science, but they're quite important here. What Hitler is describing, this ecology, he takes to be science. He takes to be the way nature actually is. And there's an important proviso, an important limit on science, which is worth marking. I'm going to return to it at the very end. Science gives us this description of the world, and science cannot change it. Hitler rules out from the beginning the possibility that something very simple might happen, like, for example, science might improve fertilizers or pesticides such that we'd have plenty of food, and this whole struggle would make no sense. So Hitler realizes there's such a theoretical possibility, but he rules it out from the beginning. And this seems to me to be very important for the worldview, and I'll try to explain why later. The second conclusion from this is that those who spoil the universe, those who, from Hitler's point of view, threaten the entire human race, those who destroy the natural order, have to be somehow removed, have to be eliminated. A black hole must be found somewhere on the planet for the Jews. And for most of the time that Hitler is thinking about this, and for most of the time that we'll be considering Hitler's policy, the closest thing that Hitler has to an idea of where that black hole is going to be is Madagascar. Madagascar. Now, this is the point where we nod and we chuckle and we think how strange that is. And it's the point where I have to overcome that sense in you of how strange that is and how odd for us to understand the next level of Hitler's thought. The reason why Hitler thought about Madagascar is much more straightforward than it might seem. Hitler was still functioning in an imperial world. He grew up in the 1880s and the 1890s, when the surface of the earth was still covered for the most part by maritime empires. The notion that you would move people about here and there, one way or the other, was not strange in this world of empires. In particular, the Germans had had colonies in Africa all the way to the end of the First World War. And to just give you one little colonial incident, which is often forgotten, when the Germans pursued a policy of the extermination of the Herero and the Nama in German southwestern Africa, after they had killed most of the men, what did they do with the rest of the population they could round up? They put them on a little island off the coast called Shark Island. So the idea of taking a race and putting it on an island and seeing what would then happen was not only something new or strange, it had been done before, right? But the reality of the imperial world, or the imperial mindset, goes much deeper than this. The reason why Madagascar, as such, could be on the mind or on the tongue of Hitler is that Madagascar, as a so-called solution to the Jewish problem, had been discussed in France, in Britain, and then finally in Germany since the 1890s. Madagascar was also the official foreign policy of the Republic of Poland in the 1930s. Poland actually went so far as to inquire of the French prime minister, Madagascar being a French possession, right, who happened to be a Jew, Léon Blum, about the possibility of acquiring Madagascar as a place to land its Jews. Léon Blum agreed to this possibility. The Poles sent a mission, and this was further discussed. Right? Now, Poland being Poland, there was a secret and totally implausible foreign policy goal here. Their idea was different from Hitler's idea in that they thought if we send Polish Jews to Madagascar, they will Polonize the place, and this will be the beginning of our African empire, right? Which sort of shows you both the level of imagination and implausibility of interwar Polish foreign policy, a subject to which we'll return. But the main thing I'm trying to get across to you here is that in this world of empire, the idea that you might displace, or that there might be black holes, there might be ways of exterminating people by moving them around, or at least getting them out of your polity by moving them around, was not strange at all. Which brings me to the next level of analysis in Mein Kampf and in the other writings, which is the global. And here I want to make a brief reference to Girard. What I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to write trying to present to you, I haven't written a word of it, trying to present to you a kind of asynchronic global history, a kind of history of a moment. And this is representative, I think, of what a lot of historians are doing today. Rather than writing longitudinal, vertical histories of individual nations, they're trying to write global histories. And of course, you pay the price in global history that you can't cover as much time. You cover less time, you cover more space. And when you cover less time and more space, what you're concerned with is interactions among peoples, among states, during that moment. And I think for that very reason, we might be at a cusp where Girard is going to come back into fashion. Okay, now that prediction has been recorded and people can laugh at me 5 years from now. But it's a possibility. So the global history, at least in this case, is very much one of reciprocity. To understand how Hitler sees not the planet, ecology, but the globe, economy, one has to understand how he saw Great Britain, America, and the Soviet Union. So to begin with Great Britain. Hitler knows that food is not just something we scratch out of the ground like animals. That's where he begins, that's his premise, but he knows that we don't just scratch food out of the ground like animals. He's perfectly aware that food is not just a matter of literally getting enough calories, but that food is also a commodity. Grain is a commodity, traded internationally. And that, says Hitler, is the problem. the free market, free trade, as it's supported by Britain, is not the nice, neutral, natural struggle that Hitler wants, that Hitler believes is natural. No, no. The free market is a kind of delusion. Great Britain can claim that the free market is neutral because Great Britain is the only state in the world that has the maritime capacity to actually protect its own food supply. Therefore, it's natural that the British would say that free trade is a very good thing because when push comes to shove, they're the only ones who can defend their own access to food, and no one else can do that. So behind the idea of a free market stands the British fleet. And behind the British fleet, remember we're talking about Hitler now, behind the British fleet stand the Jews. And Hitler's particular obsession is that Jews will kill people by starvation. This is an idea he gets from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, by the way. So his particular obsession is the Jews will kill others by denying them food. And the historical event which seems to lend this plausibility is the blockade of Germany during the First World War. In case you've forgotten, Britain and the Allies blockaded Germany during the entire course of the First World War, and even after the war was over, until the Germans signed at Versailles. And as Hitler points out, this does make a bit of a mockery of the idea of a free market, right? If there is a free market, what could violate it more than a 5-year ban on the trade of the most fundamental commodity to one of the largest markets in the world, which is, after all, what a blockade would be. So Hitler understands that food is a commodity, and he understands more than that. He understands that specialization is inevitable. His idea is not that Germany has to grow everything itself. He understands that in a globalized world, as we would say, naturally there are going to be international markets. Naturally, Germany is going to get food from very far afield. He understands that specialization is inevitable. He also understands that it brings vulnerability, as with a blockade. So how do you get out of this vulnerability? The way that you escape this vulnerability is you create a new world. You conquer for yourself enough territory that you have all of the food you need in every possible circumstance. You create what Hitler called, and what everyone in the 1930s called, it was a very fashionable idea, autarky. You create a kind of self-sufficiency on the scale that you need to create it. In other words, you take the globalization that you have, you undo it, you re-globalize. You take enough territory that the shape of the world economy has been changed. Now, Hitler knows something else. Now we're moving to the US. He knows that food isn't just calories that we scratch out of the ground. He also knows that food is not just a commodity, something which sails around the world on ships. He is also aware that food means comfort, right? You've come to a 7 o'clock lecture, so I'm sure one of your thoughts today was, did I eat before this lecture or am I going to eat after this lecture, right? Right? Right, okay. So Hitler understood this about you, right? Hitler understood this about human beings. He understood that food isn't just calories or a commodity. He understood that food was about comfort, that food wasn't just about a struggle for existence or even about reliable supplies economically, but about a kind of struggle for leisure, a struggle for leisure, that food was about the nice dining room table. And he was aware, as we would put it, that because of globalization, German housewives were aware of the standard of living of American housewives. He had a kind of obsession with German housewives. That German housewives were aware of the standard of living of Americans, and that they would not tolerate falling behind the standard of living of Americans, right? So this idea of Lebensraum, of going forth and conquering enough territory so that you're self-sufficient, has to be understood ecologically. We're going to transform our ecosphere. It has to be understood economically. We're going to have access to the commodity of food in an unbroken way. But it also has to be understood in terms of home economics. Lebensraum for Hitler means this dramatic rush to the east to take territory, but it also means for him the same thing that it means in Austrian furniture advertisements today. It means a living room. It means a comfortable place. It means comfort in the home. It means women being content with their lot in life, which means that it's not, you have to have Lebensraum sufficient not just to survive, not just to be independent, but to be prosperous. That's an important part of this vision. Now, America in this vision seems to be the bad news, because from Hitler's point of view, America is a colossus. It's a superpower at the very beginning of a terrifyingly grand history, and it's rich and is only going to be richer. But there's good news for this vision. The good news for this vision, the good news for Hitler's vision, is that America shows how you can in fact do this. Right? Hitler's understanding of the United States of America is, for the most part, rather positive. Hitler's understanding of the United States is that it provides a model for settler colonization. Right? What Hitler wanted to do in the East in Eurasia. He saw America just having done in the West. Again, remember when he is growing up, it's the 1880s and the 1890s. The frontier is being claimed and then finally completed. The United States is expanding essentially right through the point of Hitler's political consciousness, the First World War. So from Hitler's point of view, Germany has a manifest destiny, and that is to reach to the Volga Mountains. The territory which has to be controlled above all, the territory which will change Germany's destiny in all of these ways, ecological, economical, home economical, is the fertile soil of Ukraine. As Hitler puts it, and you could repeat quotations like this over and over again, as Hitler puts it, the Volga will be our Mississippi. Right? The Volga will be our Mississippi. And in case the resonance of that comparison is lost on you, after the Louisiana Purchase, Jefferson said, the Mississippi will be the line beyond which Indians will either be expelled or they'll be killed. Right? So, now, the Soviet Union. I just dropped as though it were meaningless this idea that this is the territory which is controlled by the Soviet Union. Why did Hitler think that he could so swiftly, so easily, so completely conquer territory which is controlled by what would seem at first glance to be a very powerful state, the Soviet Union? Hitler's answer is that communism, like capitalism, is not what it claims to be. Just as capitalism is a kind of facade for Jewish power, communism is a kind of facade for Jewish power. The Soviet Union, says Hitler, is a Jewish state. It's a Jewish state whose Jewish leaders have carried out countless horrors upon the non-Jewish population and would do so to the rest of the world if they could. But for Hitler, this means that this is a state that is easily destroyed. It looks powerful because the clever Jews at the top, from Hitler's point of view, can easily manipulate the subhuman Slavic and Asiatic peoples, right? From Hitler's point of view, that's not surprising. But if you can get into that territory and kill the Jews, the state will then collapse, and the territory will be yours, as will be those subhuman Slavic and Asiatic peoples with whom you can do whatever you want. This is how Hitler sees the history of Eastern Europe. Hitler believes that the Slavs of Eastern Europe have never had a state of their own. They've never been able to govern themselves. For hundreds of years, they were governed by Germanic peoples. Now with the Soviet Union, there's a brief interval where they're governed by the Jews, and all we have to do is end that brief interval, restore the Slavs to their normal history, and everything will be right with the world. Now, the implications of this are quite clear. If the Germans are going to colonize Eastern Europe the way that the Americans have colonized North America, this means that there will have to be a war against the Soviet Union, that the war against the Soviet Union will be fought as a war against the Jewish state, and along the way, and this is now something which Hitler was not so aware of, but you will be aware of it, any war fought from Germany against the Soviet Union is going to involve the territories where, in the world of that epoch, Jews lived. The demographic homeland of the Jews was between Berlin and Moscow. So any war which comes from Germany against the Soviet Union, fought for whatever purpose, would bring the Jews under German control. Right. This brings us to the lowest level, the simplest level, and the most familiar level of Hitler's thought, his thought about Germany. What I'd like to submit to you is that this is by far the weakest level of his thought, that it's essentially incoherent. If you consider, so the other levels of his thought might seem preposterous and wild, right, and ecstatic and apocalyptic, but they have coherence. They are explanations of the world that are able to take facts and put them in their place, right? They're stories which are able to absorb challenges and move on, which is Hannah Arendt's definition of coherence. She thinks coherence is a very dangerous thing, and she's right. The weakest level of his thought is with Germany. If you think of the beer hall putsch, Hitler trying to take power in Munich essentially by walking with a few dozen people down the street, right? You realize the level of the incoherence of his thought. This was an anarchist move. This was like what the syndicalists thought. They thought if you make some kind of dramatic gesture on the street, then the world will change. That's not true. That's not what happens. The German state had no trouble with that kind of resistance, and some of Hitler's best friends were killed. Many of them went to prison, including him. So what do I mean when I say this is incoherent? When we think of the history of political thought, and here I'm not being grand, I really mean the whole thing, from the Greeks forward. When we think of the history of political thought, the idea of nature, or of a state of nature, is basically there as a foil to explain how government arose, or why you need government, right? That's what nature is there for. In the Hobbesian view, for example, in the state of nature, we're all struggling against each other, which explains why we have and why we need government, right? That's just one of the more familiar versions. in Hitler's thinking, all you have is nature. There isn't any justification of the state at all. The state is not something which he is considering conceptually at all. What he thinks is nature has a problem. Nature's problem is the Jews. As he puts it, the Jews are pollution, the Jews are parasites, the Jews are bacteria. One has to understand this pollution and this infection not at the level of individual human beings or even societies, but of the entire ecosphere of the planet. Jews pollute the world, is Hitler's view. So nature has a problem, but the only good thing is natural harmony. Now, what I'm trying to say is that even from Hitler's own point of view, this is incoherent. What you're going to try to do is save nature from itself, you have to have some kind of state power, right? You have to have some kind of power which is going to begin the process of healing nature. So there are countless reasons why this theory is wrong. I'm not going to detain you with them. What I just want you to notice is that this view is essentially paradoxical. He sees the proper state of the world as a kind of zoological anarchy in which species and races are just fighting it out without political authority. But in order to exterminate the Jews, in order to get rid of the Jews, in order to save nature, you would have to have some kind of political authority, right? There's a paradox here, even within the view itself. Now, Hitler begins to think his way toward how he would solve this problem in the 1920s. In the late 1920s, in his very important and totally unread second book, he gives a model for Germany. And it's a very interesting model because of what it tells us of how he was thinking about Germany and Germans. His model for the German state was the Balkans. He says the only states that have an admirable foreign policy are the Balkans. Serbia, Bulgaria, Macedonia, places like this. Now, why would Hitler possibly have thought this? Like, try to think of some other German who has said something nice about the Balkans in the history of modern political thought or action, right? The most famous remark is the idea that, the Balkans, when you want to say something bad about Vienna, you say that the Balkans begin at the Rheinstrasse, right? So that a German would say that the Balkans are a model for our own polity, something very interesting must be going on. And here's what's going on. Hitler correctly sees that the Balkan states, over the course of the 19th century, had created a new model of the nation state. He correctly sees that the Balkan states were militarist, in the precise sense that almost all of their budgets went towards the army, and in the precise sense that they had no domestic policy except for conquering more territory and trying to tax it. I'm simplifying a little bit, but not really very much. In other words, what Hitler thinks is that and he says this word for word in the second book, the only point of having a domestic policy is to mobilize the money and the energy for foreign policy. And what foreign policy means, of course, is conquest. So insofar as you have a state, the only purpose of having that state is to throw your men and your money out into the world, right? That's the only purpose of having a state. Now, this is interesting because it gives you a sense of how Hitler begins to think about the state. The state is you need the state as an instrument for something else. But of course, this is not going to win you elections in Germany, right? So when Hitler leaves prison and begins to try to rise to power, what we find is that the way that he does so, and this is a story that's been told very well in other places, so I'm not going to detain you with it, but the way that he does rise to power is not by emphasizing the worldview that I've been trying to explain to you here, but rather by a whole series of improvisations and compromises. In other words, when Hitler comes to power in Germany, from his perspective, coming to power, which he does in January 1933, that is not a triumph. That is a compromise. That's a compromise. Coming to power in the German state is a necessary evil, necessary for the achievement of other later things, which from his point of view would be good. Now, if we can go this far in the argument, I think it becomes very helpful, because if you can accept this much of the argument, then all the things that we know about Germany in the 1930s, all the familiar steps along the way, or the things we think are steps along the way to the Holocaust, begin to take on another aspect. What we find is that the things that we are familiar with in Germany are significant, but they're not quite significant for the reasons that we think they are. So when Hitler rises to power, he is bringing with him an idea of the state which is unusual. Just to give you an example, like what's the classic example of this? The classic definition of the state, the Weberian definition of the state, is that you seek after a monopoly on legitimate violence. right? Hitler does not do that. Hitler comes to power by way of the SA and the SS and other groups who foment violence from below. And then interestingly, once he's in power, he keeps those instruments. So the German state after 1933 does not have a monopoly on power, nor does it seek a monopoly on violent power. The SS is there as well. There's a plurality of sources of, from Hitler's point of view, legitimate violence. Now, that seems interesting because you know the SS is going to have something to do with the Holocaust. But let's try to be more precise about exactly what this means. What is the SS for? The SS has a purpose which cannot be exercised, but which can only be discussed in Germany. And that purpose is the destruction of states. Within Germany, you can only see hints of this. The most profound hint is the concentration camp. What is the concentration camp? The concentration camp, according to German lawyers, more clever than our lawyers when faced with the same problem, the German lawyers defined as a stateless zone, as a zone where law did not apply, a lawless area. That's what concentration camps were. Now, we think we know that concentration camps are the thing that led to the Holocaust, and we're wrong about that. The Holocaust did not take place in concentration camps. The real relevance of the concentration camps is they give us a signal of what the SS does, which is to create stateless zones. As we move forward, we're going to see how important this is. When, by the way, is the first time that Jews actually come to concentration camps in very large numbers? 1938. 5 years after Hitler has come to power. And when do they do so? Why do they do so? Under what circumstances? They begin to do so when another state is destroyed. So a crucial moment for the development of the policies that become the Holocaust is the Anschluss of March of 1938, the annexation of Austria. I was reading a testimony of an Austrian survivor of the Holocaust, a young woman, an Orthodox woman. She talked about how her family, and I'm sure this was true of many, many Orthodox families, on the night of March 11th, 1938, were listening to the radio, violating the Sabbath by listening to the radio, because the Chancellor of Austria, Schuschnigg, was giving a speech in which he was going to explain what was going to happen to the state. And what he said at 7:39 that evening was that he had capitulated and that the Austrian state would be no more, that Germany was going to come, that Austria was going to be annexed. At that moment, and this is why I'm remembering this testimony, at that moment everything changed. The way this woman begins her testimony is with the words, overnight. It all happened overnight. And that's a slight exaggeration, but it brings us to something very interesting. At the moment when statehood ends in Austria, literally the moment, March 11th, 12th, 13th, a few days and a few weeks, there is more violence in Austria against Jews than in the entire period of Nazi rule in Germany, and by a wide margin, by a very wide margin, in that day and in those weeks. And there is ritual humiliation of Jews, not only on a scale, but of a quality that one has not yet seen in Germany. Again, beginning that very night, the night of March the 11th, the 12th, 1938. And the way that the Jews are ritually humiliated is quite precise and quite informative, unfortunately. They're forced to scrub the streets. Some of you might know this idea that Jews have to scrub the streets, they have to clean the streets. But they're not exactly cleaning the streets. They're rubbing something very particular off the streets. They're rubbing paint off the streets. They're rubbing painted letters off the streets. What do those letters say? They say Österreich. They say Austria. Why are those letters on the street? Those letters are on the street because the government of Austria was going to call a referendum on its own independence. And this was the electoral propaganda for that referendum, which, by the way, it was going to win, almost certainly. When the Germans come in, what the Jews have to do is they have to scrub that electoral propaganda off the streets. Not anything else, precisely that. In other words, the Jews are being identified with the previous order, and the humiliation that they're performing shows what is next for them, right? The Jews are made to perform the transition from one order to the next. They are directly connected to state destruction in the sense, of course, that they've lost all their rights as Austrian citizens. And remember, in Austria, there weren't Nuremberg laws, right? All of these things that we think must lead to the Holocaust, those things didn't exist in Austria. There weren't Nuremberg laws in Austria. One day to the next, Jews go from being more or less normal citizens to being ritually humiliated en masse. And they're being ritually humiliated in a way which I think is very suggestive. Because this opportunity of state destruction, the things that you can do when you destroy someone else's state, are quickly understood by the SS. So the name of Eichmann will be familiar to you. Eichmann gets his start in Austria. What he finds in Austria is that in a matter of a few months, he can get more Jews out of the country faster than Germany could do in a matter of years. Why? Because the state had been destroyed. It opens up all kinds of possibilities. Immigration goes much further and much faster in Austria than it had done in the Reich itself. Now, the destruction of Austria then becomes a model for the destruction of Czechoslovakia. You'll remember Munich, which functions here as a kind of symbol of how you shouldn't appease and so on. Munich of late September 1938. What happens with Munich is that part of Czechoslovakia is annexed, preparatory to the rest of it being destroyed. Now, I mentioned immigration. Immigration of Jews was one of the two major anti-Semitic policies of the Third Reich in the 1930s. The other was something called Aryanization, which was the expropriation of Jewish property. Czechoslovakia shows what can happen with expropriation, with what the Germans call Aryanization. Because the Czech Jews know that their state is about to be destroyed, they know that they're about to lose all of their rights, that their civil code, the civil code of Czechoslovakia, is going to evaporate, just like the Austrian did. They know that their property rights are soon going to be null and void. And so they sell preemptively. They sell what they have so they can leave the country. Right? So the fact that Czechoslovakia is going to be destroyed means that Czechoslovak Jews are expropriated, again, much, much, much faster than German Jews are. What happens in Austria in March 1938 is also a model for another familiar event, the Kristallnacht in Germany itself on the night of November 9th to 10th. Kristallnacht was the first major episode of violence against Jews inside the Reich itself, inside the pre-war boundaries of Germany. It's also the first time that Jews were taken to camps in large numbers, Kristallnacht. And this is the Austrian model. It's organized from the center. Jews are humiliated, synagogues are burned, several hundred Jews are killed. We know all of this. But what I want you to see is that this is the Austrian model finding its limits. Destroying Austria opens a window where you can do certain things. You can make the Jews scrub the streets. You can get the Jews out of the country. You can steal the property of the streets. But then, when you incorporate Austria, it has to become part of the Reich. There has to be some kind of rule of law. When you try the Austrian model inside the Reich itself, what you learn, and by you I mean Himmler, Heydrich, Göring, all of whom opposed Kristallnacht, what you learn is that you can't have anarchy inside the state itself. Maybe in a kind of transitory moment when you're annexing someone else's state, but you can't do it inside the state itself. This is the paradox which is at the heart of Hitler's thought. If you are an ecological anarchist and you want to change things, you need state power. And this is the lesson that is learned in Kristallnacht. In other words, Kristallnacht at the time seemed like the depths of barbarism. It seemed like the worst thing that Germany could possibly do, and it's still remembered and commemorated as the beginning of the Holocaust. But in fact, although it was horrible, it showed the limits of what Germany could do inside Germany. Now, how could those limits be transcended? Those limits could be transcended by invading Poland. The invasion of Poland is the crucial example of how Hitler continues to improvise his way towards actually realizing his ecological view of the world. Now, why do I emphasize improvise? Because the whole history of the Second World War, as we know it, involves the people are on the good side, people are on the bad side, the Allies and so on, the Allies and the enemies. But Hitler thought that Poland was going to be on his side. Right? I mean, this is a little uncomfortable for the Poles and for the Germans and for everyone else. But remember, Hitler's basic goal is to invade the Soviet Union. There's one country between Poland and between Germany and the Soviet Union, right? That's Poland. So something's going to have to be done with Poland. There are two, in German war planning, there are two possibilities. One possibility is that Poland is a friendly neutral, and the other possibility is that Poland is an ally, right? Those are the reasonable possibilities as far as Germany is concerned. It only becomes clear late in 1938 that this is not going to happen, and that it's more likely that the Poles are going to resist. So that the Second World War begins in Poland and not somewhere else is actually a surprise for Hitler. It's something that he has to adapt to. And the way that he adapts, the way that the Nazis adapt, the way that German institutions adapt, is by seizing the occasion to surpass previous limits. The war plans that are cooked up for Poland very quickly in the spring of 1939, the summer of 1939, involve a new idea. Not just the destruction of a state, as in Austria and Czechoslovakia, but the malevolent destruction of a state with the intention of preventing that state from ever arising again. In other words, the extermination of the political class of that state such that the idea of that state ever coming about again becomes impossible. Now, how is this carried out? It's carried out in two ways, one of which is usually forgotten, especially in the Holocaust literature, one of which we remember. The forgotten one is state destruction by proxy. So, remember Hitler's improvising. The war against Poland, improvisation. How it's fought, also improvisation. The ally that Germany chooses for its war against Poland is none other than its central ideological enemy, the Soviet Union. Right? In August of 1939, the Germans and the Soviets come to a military alliance known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. In September 1939, the Soviet Union and Germany jointly invade Poland and divide it roughly in half. On September 28, 1939, they sign a treaty of borders on friendship, of borders and friendship. So this is, from Hitler's point of view, think about this. Think about what he's just done. This is state destruction by proxy. Hitler has an idea of what the Soviet Union is like. If anything, his idea is much worse than the reality, right? So in signing this agreement with Stalin, he is ensuring that what the Soviets do, which in his view is starving, shooting, and deporting by the million, right? What the Soviets do is now being brought into half of Poland, as well as into the Baltic states. So state destruction is being carried out by proxy by people, by the way, who are professionals at it. The Soviets are much more technically proficient at this kind of thing in 1939 than the Germans are. 1939 is not the first time the Soviets have done this sort of thing. It is the first time the Germans have done this sort of thing. What they do in their half of Poland is they send in the Einsatzgruppen. Now, who are the Einsatzgruppen? These are specially formed paramilitary units subordinate to the SS whose job is state destruction. That's what they're there for. They're there to make sure that everyone in Poland who has an education will be removed, that is to say, killed, so that it's not just that the Polish army will lose, but that the Polish state can't arise again because there will never be anything like a Polish nation again. The Slavs will be returned to their natural state, which is subhuman laborers for a future triumphant Reich. That's the idea. So the Einsatzgruppen try to physically eliminate the Polish educated classes. They are, by the way, unsuccessful in this, and they're much less successful than the Soviets, but that's another story. What happens to the Jews? Well, in this phase, after 1939, what happens to the Jews is that their property is taken away from them. They are moved from the countryside into the cities, and from the parts of the cities which they lived into ghettos. And this is preparatory to sending them to Madagascar, which I hope by now will seem like something more or less normal to you. The idea is that they're going to be sent from the ghettos to Madagascar. Now, but Hitler has improvised. The Poles were interested in some kind of Madagascar, but he's destroyed Poland, right? The idea of getting rid of the European Jews always made more sense in an alliance with Poland, because most of the European Jews lived in Poland. Right? There are a few 100,000 Jews in Germany. There are as many Jews in Łódź, right, a city of which many of you probably haven't even heard, than there are in Germany. There are more Jews in Łódź than in Palestine, for that matter, at this time. There are more Jews in Warsaw than in Germany. Right? So in invading half of Poland, the number of Jews under German control has gone from a few 100,000 to a couple of million. So the pre-war idea that we're going to probably work something like this out with the Poles, crazy though it might seem, makes more sense of doing it than doing it without the Poles. Right? Now you've destroyed the Polish state. You have all these Jews under your control. How are you going to possibly get them to Madagascar? Now, in the spring of 1940, Germany invades the Low Countries and France and destroys France. And this makes Madagascar seem realistic once again. The first thing that German diplomats do upon arriving in Paris, well, probably not the first thing. I mean, there was probably, some expressions of joy and so on. But one of the very first things they did was to go to the archives of the French Foreign Ministry and look for the documents of Polish-French discussions of Madagascar in 1936 and 1937. Because they thought that now that France has been destroyed, we will be able to send our Jews to Madagascar. The reason why this is stopped is Great Britain. Great Britain, from Hitler's point of view, should have been deterred at this point from taking part in the war. It should have been knocked out of the war. It should have been frightened and intimidated by the defeat of France. But it's not. And the British, remember, are the only naval power in the world. Hitler understands that, which means that there's no way you can get those Jews to Madagascar. So the thinking has to change. And it does change. When does it change? It changes decisively in the summer of 1941. In the summer of 1941, Hitler begins the war, which from his point of view is the war. It is the decisive war on every level that we've talked about, every single level that we've talked about, the war against the Soviet Union. The war against the Soviet Union is the planetary struggle for existence. It is the attainment of Lebensraum. It is the breaking of Jewish power, at least in this part of the world. Everything else from Hitler's point of view, much as we find it interesting, the war with Britain, France, Poland, even with America, is a kind of sideshow. This is the central effort that Hitler is calling upon the Germans to make. Now, this is crucial for the Jews for reasons that you're already going to have understood. It's crucial for the Jews because now we know that the way that Germany makes war against enemies is not just to defeat armies, but to destroy political societies. This is the novelty in German warfighting. We're not just going to defeat your army and put you under conventional occupation. We're going to defeat your army and we are going to physically eliminate your political class so that you can be returned to the natural state which you really should be in, which is slavery to us. Right? This is a German innovation. Now, the reason why it's critical for the Jews of the Soviet Union is that Hitler's understanding of the political class in the Soviet Union is different than his understanding of the political class in Poland. The political class in Poland was educated Poles, which included a lot of Jews, by the way, but that was the definition. His definition of the political class in the Soviet Union includes precisely all Jews, or at least Jewish males 17 to 65, right? So when the Einsatzgruppen go into the Soviet Union, when the Einsatzgruppen follow the German army into the Soviet Union, in some sense they do the same thing that they did in Poland. They try to physically eliminate the political class. But the definition of the political class is different now. The definition of the political class includes the Jews, which means that the Einsatzgruppen, as they move into the Soviet Union, for the first time carry out very large-scale shootings of Jews. And this is, I think, something like the beginning of what we consider the Holocaust. Now, when the Germans invade the Soviet Union, what are they actually invading? And here's the first and only point where I wish I had a map and a laser pointer. What are they actually invading? Are they invading the Soviet Union? No, not exactly. They're invading the territories which the Soviet Union has just invaded, right? The territories the German armies are going into in June of 1941 are the territories that the Soviet army went into in September of 1939, or in the Baltics in June of 1940. The German invasion of the Soviet Union begins with an invasion of places that have already been invaded and destroyed, already been invaded and subject to policies of state destruction. So by June of 1941, we are talking about a territory of double state destruction. First, the Germans have destroyed state institutions, so to speak, by proxy. Then they come in and they do it all over again themselves, destroying the Soviet elites and the Jews who they define as Soviet elites. Now, the first murderous policy associated with this is the pogroms of summer of 1941. The best known of which is Jedwabne, because of the book by Jan Gross, the very important book by Jan Gross. But Jedwabne was one of about 200 such instances in which about 20,000 Jews were killed by their neighbors in a broad span of territory from the Baltic to the Black Seas. This was, in effect, the Anschluss model. This is the provocation of pogroms, as with Anschluss in Austria, as with Kristallnacht in Germany. You try to provoke pogroms and you see what happens. And as with Austria and Germany, this turns out to be inadequate. It turns out to be insufficient. The local populations are not as interested in this as the German. We can consider why they are as interested as they are, but from the German point of view, they're much less interested than the Germans expected. But I want you to mark what the Jews do, because it will remind you of Anschluss. What do the Jews do in all of these towns before they're killed? The Soviets have put up a statue of Lenin, and the Jews have to take it down. They have to take it down, they have to bury it, they have to take it down, they have to chop its head off, they have to take it down, they have to ritually humiliate it. In other words, once again, the Jews are serving not only as the reality of the destruction of a state, but as the symbol of it. And the way that they're being humiliated tells you how they're going to be treated in the order that's going to come. So that's why I mentioned the pogroms. But the main way that Jews are killed takes shape over the course of the summer and fall of 1941. In the summer and fall of 1941, Hitler's idea of Judeo-Bolshevism, that Jews are Bolsheviks and Bolsheviks are Jews, now makes contact with a part of the world where Bolsheviks have actually been in power. Not that Jews have been in power, just so you don't misunderstand me. That's totally irrelevant. Jews have not been in power in this part of the world. Soviets have been in power. But the fact that the Soviets have been in power means that this notion that the Soviets are Jews and the Jews are Soviets can get some kind of political traction. In humiliated societies, I think humiliation is more important than revenge. In societies where people care about sovereignty because they've just lost it, which is difficult for us to understand. I mean, if the Americans lost sovereignty, would we want it back? Yeah, I mean, despite what one hears on talk radio, yes, we would want sovereignty back. That could be used to motivate us in various ways. These people wanted sovereignty back. And now the Judeo-Bolshevik idea gains political traction because what the Germans can say is, we offer you liberation, but the liberation we're offering you is liberation from the Jews. So insofar as you want your own liberation, you want to do something about it, you will join us in killing the Jews. This does not have to work on very many people. It has to work on several thousand people, which it does. And with the help of locals, the Germans now have enough manpower to actually carry out the mass shootings of Jews on a very, very large scale. And this is the beginning of the final solution becoming the Holocaust. By the end of 1941, something like we think of as the Holocaust is underway. 1 million Jews have been killed by the end of 1941, almost all of them by shooting. Now, this is important because we've now found the technique which is more or less sufficient for the final solution. The technique is mass shooting of Jews where they live. The reason this is crucial is that this is the technique which teaches Hitler that something like the final solution can actually be carried out. Deportation has proven to be impossible. The last deportation idea was we're going to push the Jews across the Ural Mountains. We're going to push them, Heydrich thinks, into the Gulag. That proves impossible because the Soviets resist. What has proven to be possible is killing the Jews where they live. This is crucial because it's the lesson that Hitler learns in 1941. So what this means then is that the planetary idea, the ecological idea of destroying the Jews now has its own trajectory. It now has its own logic, which will be followed even as the war goes back and forth. But the points I want to stress now before we move towards the end is what we've seen here. We asked at the beginning about a black hole. From Hitler's conception, ecological conception of the world, there had to be a black hole where the Jews could be put. He was vague about this, but insofar as there was an idea, it was Madagascar. It turns out that the black hole where Jews could be put is the place in Europe, is the middle of Europe, is the place in Europe where the state has been destroyed twice. There and nowhere else. That is where the Holocaust can begin. That is the black hole, that zone of double state destruction. And if we continue this thought, the Holocaust as such, all of the rest of it, takes place in a zone of state destruction. The whole thing takes place in a zone of state destruction. In the Soviet Union, as German forces continue to move east, it's carried out by shooting. So people are continually recruited into shooting battalions. The shooting continues. In Poland, as you all will know, in occupied Poland, the killing is carried out in gas chambers. Now, I want to ask you for a moment what these gas chambers are, or dwell on what they are, because we think of them as being like concentration camps, which they're not. They're not concentration camps. They're killing facilities, and they're killing facilities that are created from a kind of mixture of fragments of the states that have been destroyed. This is a new way of thinking about what they are, so let me just take a minute with them. Because if you think about it, it's actually it's a difficult question. How does it happen that a death facility is created on territory? What do you need to create a death facility on territory? The question is so hard that it usually pushes us into literature or into metaphysics. But I think the answer is you can create it when you have at your disposal certain kinds of fragments of states that no longer exist. What do I mean? Well, the technique that was used in the gas chambers was carbon monoxide. That's a fragment of an earlier program in Germany. Like Kristallnacht, the euthanasia program, which was undertaken in Germany to kill so-called life unworthy of life, that program proved impossible to carry out in the open in Germany. What happens then is that the technicians of that program, the people who invented and applied the technique of killing by carbon monoxide, those people and their techniques and their tools are moved to places like Treblinka, Belzec, and Sobibor. So that's one fragment. Another fragment, the guards. Who guards these places? Usually we think, though, they're Ukrainians, they're Russians. The people who guard these places are also a fragment of statehood. The first group of people who guards these places are Soviet prisoners of war, people who are triply stateless, people who have been taken prisoner by the Germans, who say they're going to destroy the Soviet state. Then the Soviet state announces that anyone who surrenders no longer is a Soviet citizen, doubly stateless, and they're on territory where the state has been completely wiped out. And to make matters worse, they're going to starve to death. Right? There are death camps. The death camps are where the Soviet prisoners of war die. 3 million of them will die. It's the second biggest German war crime. We can't pause on it here, but what we know about it is that it becomes the recruiting ground for the people who then guard the death facilities for the Jews. Second fragment. Third fragment. Who are the people who come into the ghettos when the ghettos are emptied to reinforce the local police, the local German police? They're, for the most part, Ukrainian and Baltic policemen. who again are recruited from places where the state is destroyed. Who is it that organizes the deportations from within? The Judenrat, right? The Jewish Council. What's the Judenrat? The Judenrat is the German perversion of a perfectly legal pre-war Polish institution. Most of the people who were on the Judenrat had been the leaders of the Jewish communes inside interwar Poland. Who is guarding the peripheries of these things, and who is hunting down Jews if they happen to escape? The Polish police, another fragment. Until 1938, Polish policemen stopped pogroms. Why? Because pogroms are against the law. In a bourgeois state with a civil code and property rights, pogroms are against the law, and they were stopped. There were a lot of attempts. They were almost all stopped. In 1942, the Polish police, unhinged now from the Polish state, and from law as such, I would argue, are killing Jews. Were they stopping pogroms because they loved Jews? No. Were they killing Jews because they hated them? Not necessarily. What's changed dramatically here is the state. And the final fragment, and this is the thought I want to leave you with here, the final fragment here is something which I would call the dark market. You all know enough about economics to understand profit motives and incentive structures. What happens if you take a certain group of people, the Jews, and you say, these people cannot have property? Well, a very bad thing happens because other people take their property and those other people don't want the Jews to come back. What if you say, in addition to that, these people not only cannot have property, these people are property in the sense that a price can be put on their head. And also in the sense that if you own them, this is a special kind of property, you can be killed. In that incentive structure, microeconomics predicts very beautifully what's going to happen next, right? The logical thing that microeconomics would predict that you or anyone would do in that situation is that if a Jew came to you for help and offered you money, you would take the money and kill the Jew, which is pretty much what happened, right? It's a very, very dark story. But it's impossible to understand without seeing how markets themselves, when unhinged from the civil code and when manipulated in a certain way, can lead towards this final moment of destruction. Okay, now, at this point, you're probably, if you're not thinking about dinner, right? You were thinking about rescue. You're wondering, like, when is the good part, right? When are the rescuers going to come in? When is some other kind of logic going to intervene here? And of course, the dominant truth is that it's peripheral, right? Rescue is peripheral. Let me give you a couple of points of comparison. You may know the nice story of Denmark. Right? What is Denmark? Denmark's a German ally. It supplies 10% of Germany's food. So therefore, we have a nice story about how the Danes rescue their Jews. The 99% of Danish Jews who were still in Denmark in 1943 survive. They go on little boats to Sweden, which is neutral and has agreed to accept them. In Estonia, 99% of the Jews are killed. Now, so you have the most radical possible alternatives. 99% survive, 99% are killed. Estonia and Denmark are actually rather similar countries. They're small Scandinavian countries. They have very, very small Jewish populations. Neither of them has anything like a very strong tradition of anti-Semitism. If anything, Denmark's is stronger than Estonia's, right? So why then are 99% of the Jews killed in Estonia and 99% of them survive in Denmark? The answer has everything to do, and I'm now just compressing the whole explanation, the answer has everything to do with sovereignty. When the Germans enter Denmark, they say, we are going to respect the monarchy and we're going to respect the sovereignty of the Danish state. When the Germans enter Estonia, they're entering a state which the Soviets have already destroyed and which the Germans have no intention to do anything with except to make it a colony. These radical alternatives, 99%, 99%, give you a sense of the whole map of Europe. In general, and this is the only factor you can single out like this, in general, the degree of sovereignty that remains predicts the number of Jews who are going to survive. And this is a point which Hannah Arendt made without making. Hannah Arendt was obsessed with the idea of Jews as the stateless. The point that I'm adding to this is that the best way to make people stateless, the fastest, the most effective way to make people stateless is to destroy their state. Right? You can generate millions of stateless people wholesale that way. It's much more effective than immigration or oppression. Just destroy the state, get rid of the civil code, and their passports suddenly mean nothing. And so from this you can see the basic pattern. If you're in a place where there was no state, your chances as a Jew of surviving were 1 in 20, about 5%. If you were in a place where there was a state, even if that state was a German ally, like Italy, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, even if that state was Nazi Germany, your chances of surviving were about 1 in 2. Now, there's an individual story one can tell for each of those countries, but that's the overall average of reality. And if one looks at particular cases, one sees interesting truths that confirm this. So the French Holocaust. Think of the French Holocaust. Who were the victims of the French Holocaust? Well, French Jews, you would think, right? They're the second largest group of victims in the French Holocaust. Who's the largest group? The Polish Jews, of course, because Poland no longer exists. The policy of France, like other satellites, like other allies, is not to give all of its Jews to Germany. I mean, there are twists and turns, and it's a complicated story. Their policy is to get rid of stateless people, right? And so the overlap is Polish Jews. So the biggest victim group in France during the Holocaust is not the French Jews, it's the Polish Jews because they're stateless. Or to give you another example, when we ask about rescuers, who are the rescuers who actually made the biggest difference? Sugihara, right, the Japanese consul in Kaunas, who saves several hundred Jews, maybe more than that. The Chinese consul in Vienna also saves several hundred Jews. There's an American diplomat who saves a number of Jews. Why diplomats? Why are diplomats so central, especially when it comes to people who save more than a few Jews? You know the answer. Because diplomats are the only people that can give you state recognition. Right? A diplomat can give you a piece of paper which says, I am giving you some kind of recognition, even if that recognition is only that you can go to my state. So diplomats are the only people who have the power to reverse the thing which makes it possible to kill Jews. They can give Jews some kind of state recognition. If you ask again about the actual operations which save large numbers of Jews, there's only one. There's only one government policy which tries to save Jews, and that's the Polish operation known as Żegota, which is funded by Jews, largely by American Jews. But that money gets into Poland on the money belts of paratroopers, state power. Polish government in exile is dropping paratroopers with money from American Jews into Warsaw to sustain Jews who have survived the roundups. That is a state action. And when we move into other organizations which save Jews, very often the state has something to do with them. Okay, so I haven't gotten to the kind of rescue that you think I'm going to talk about, and that's for a reason. The kind of rescue that we like to talk about is almost totally marginal. Insofar as rescue happens, insofar as Jews live, it's because there is some higher political, institutional explanation having to do with sovereignty. Rescues in the zone where the Holocaust happens, in this zone which is like a black hole, do take place. And when they do, when people rescue Jews, the motivations that they have, and this is something that I've been doing a lot of research on, the motivations that they have are wholly atypical of the kinds of life that most of us live most of the time. Sometimes people rescue their very, very dear friends. Sometimes people rescue their spouses. More often, they rescue their fiancés. I'll leave you to ponder the significance of that. Very, very often, people who rescue represent some kind of deviant religiosity. That is to say, a religion which has been persecuted by the state. The people who belong to the dominant religion very, very rarely save Jews. People who belong to religions that in that time and place are persecuted are much more likely to do. The most notable example of this is Andrzej Szeptycki, who was the head of the Greek Catholic Church in Galicia at the time, who rescued about 150 Jews. His religion in the time and place had been oppressed by the dominant Polish Roman Catholic religion. Then there are people who you can't really define a motive, but it's clearly something like, you can't say anything more than it's something like goodness. The kinds of people who often, when they are asked, they'll cite the parable of the Good Samaritan. There's some kind of irreducible goodness there. These things are all working against the grain. Insofar as psychologists and sociologists have taken up this question, this is the conclusion they come to. People who rescue are working against the grain. They're working against the current. So what does this tell us? Taking a step back and now really concluding, what does this tell us about our own day? What does this tell us about the future? The first thing that it tells us is that in a moment of horrible crisis like this one, we will not rescue each other. And the reason why I stress we won't, the reason why I stress this is because in addition to the real Holocaust that happened that I'm trying to explain, there is another Holocaust which takes place in Hollywood. And the Holocaust that takes place in Hollywood always involves rescue. Schindler's List is a rescue. Defiance is a rescue. Even a film which is not a Hollywood film, which I think is quite wonderful, Agnieszka Holland's In Darkness, It's a rescue, right? So one gets the idea that the Holocaust is about the rescue of the Jews who survived, which of course it's not about. These are very unusual events, but they make the only kind of acceptable story, in effect. So there's that Holocaust which we have in our culture, which has no connection. Oh, The Pianist is another good example, right? It's a wonderful film, but it's about a rescue. It's about an atypical event. We will not rescue ourselves at the last moment. That Hollywood idea that when things get tough, we band together. No, real life was exactly the opposite. Structures could be created, or anti-structures could be created, which prevented us precisely from banding together and saving each other, which made rescue a kind of deviant behavior which people hid from their neighbors, not only when they did it, but for years and decades afterwards, as I'm sure many of you know. What does this tell us about the state? Well, I spoke of a Hollywood image. We also have a kind of popular political image, which is called totalitarianism. And by this, I don't mean Hannah Arendt's long book. I mean the way that we think of a total state. The way that we think of oppression in Germany, or in the Soviet Union for that matter, is that a strong state oppresses its own people. That is just not what happened in the Holocaust. That is just not what happened in the Holocaust. The huge majority of victims of the Holocaust had nothing to do with German culture. 97% of them did not know the German language. Or, to look at it from the other side, most of the Jews who were in Germany in 1933 died a natural death. The Holocaust simply is not a story of a repressive state progressively carrying out ever worse policies and finally killing a group inside that state. It's a story instead of the perversion of a state from within, of the incorporation of certain kinds of anarchistic elements to a state, and then the export of those elements to other states, the destruction of other states, and what that then permits. That's what actually happened in the Holocaust. And of course, if that's how one thinks about the Holocaust, the conclusions that one draws for policy or for foreign policy are rather different. But I think the most important lesson, and you'll have gathered this from where I started, has to do with ecology. If we think about the way Hitler saw the world, Hitler saw opportunities closing. He saw the surface of the earth being covered by other powers, Soviet, American, whatever it might be. He was in a race to copy those models or to supplant those models. He thought that he was running out of time. He thought that he was running out of time because of power, but he also thought he was running out of time because of the environment. He made a very fundamental error about science, which I tried to signal at the beginning. He took it as axiomatic that science cannot solve our food problems in time. And because science can't solve our food problems in time, you have to solve them in some other way. You have to move. You have to acquire territory. Now, he's wrong about science. He's wrong about it in a way which I'm sure you all understand. He's wrong to think that science means that we're in some kind of ecological racial struggle. He's wrong that the Jews are some kind of extra scientific magical force. That we can all take for granted. But he's wrong in the more banal sense about food, right? By just 25 or 30 years after Hitler comes to power, the improvements in irrigation, pesticides, and hybrids are such that Germany has more food than it needs. Now, no one ever mentions irrigation, pesticides, and hybrids when they talk. Well, okay, there are a few German historians who do. I should give credit where it's due. In general, when we think about the Holocaust, we don't think about categories like agricultural technology or agronomy. But we should, at least if we want to understand our relationship to the event, our mental relationship to the event. What I'm trying to say is that the two mistakes that Hitler makes, that Jews are this kind of extra scientific magical force that spoils the universe, and the scientific mistake that science is not going to save us from the food problem, that when you make these two mistakes simultaneously, you draw certain conclusions. If you don't believe that science can help you, and you believe that the future is not a kind of avenue of possibility, a kind of horizon of future capacity, but that the future is instead closing in on you, right? Closing in on you like a kind of tidal wave. The future is pressing in on the present, then you can draw certain conclusions. If science isn't going to work, if everything's closing in onto you, you have to solve your problems in the present. And you have to solve them not by adding things, because science isn't going to add anything. You have to solve them by taking something away, by removing that thing which is keeping you from what you want. The Girardian term for this is scapegoating. In other words, what Hitler manages to do is he manages to by destroying states, he manages to create something like the ecological struggle that he's talking about. He manages to create something like the black hole that he's talking about. Now, you'll see where I'm going, right? And this is going to be the very last thought. You'll see how this moment is, in some respects, like our own. Hitler, of course, is not among us, at least as far as, there is no person like this, as far as we know, among us. What I'm trying to say is events are such, the moment is such, the period is such, that this kind of thinking could well reappear. Why would I claim this? Well, the major difference between us and them, between those of us sitting here, between members of Western societies, between people in successful, prosperous democracies, and Germans in the 1920s and 30s, is not what we think it is. We think the main difference between us and them is that we've learned the lesson of the Second World War. I think that's nonsense. The main difference between us and them is that we have enough food. That's the main difference. We have food as calories, we have food as commodity, we have food as comfort. The simplest way to demonstrate this is to just consider the phrase counting calories, right? We count calories because we have too many. That phrase, counting calories, existed in the 1920s and 1930s. It functioned in all kinds of German documents. The reason why it's there is that they needed enough calories to put into the bellies of the horses and the oxen and the human males and females who still powered the economy there and in most of the world to make those economies work. They were counting calories because they needed to make sure they had enough of them. We count calories because we have too many of them, right? And this creates our blindness. And it cuts us off from one of the important lessons of the Holocaust, right at the moment we might need it. Why right at the moment we might need it? Because we are now re-entering what could very well be a world of finitude, a world of limits, a world at the very least of uncertainty. Uncertainty which is brought about by the reality and the expectation of global warming. This is uncertainty across multiple levels. We don't know how fast it's going to go. We don't know when the feedback loops are going to kick in. We don't know when the ice in the Arctic and Greenland is going to melt, which will increase the pace. We don't know which regions are going to be most affected. And perhaps most significantly, we don't know how other people are going to respond. Global warming, it's easy to make the argument that global warming will reduce access to food and reduce access to water. It will. But I think the thing which makes it most dangerous is the multiplying uncertainty of it, the way that it changes the way that we think about the future. One can think about the possible scenarios. One can spin out the scenarios. They're at our fingertips. Rwanda and Darfur are scenarios which have already happened. Self-genocides, internal genocides, which have something to do with drought. You can also think of other kinds of scenarios. Think of Bangladesh and Egypt, both of which are going to be essentially uninhabitable in 50 years for reasons having to do with global warming. One having to do with flooding, the other having to do with desertification. Neither of which contributes anything to global warming, right? So it's very easy to have the thought, if you are a young man, let's say in Bangladesh or Egypt, that I am being punished for the actions of this thing that's carried out caused by the Americans, right, or the West. What conclusions would you draw from that? Smaller motives for terrorism have been found. Let me put it that way. You can think of states. I mean, the only states that have the power to project at this point are the United States and China. But the concern that China might have is obvious. The glaciers from which China gets its water are melting. They're going to be gone in 40 years. China doesn't have enough fertile soil, right? Which means that China is buying up parcels in Africa, probably with the idea of feeding itself in the future, which will then lead indirectly to Africans killing themselves, and we'll look at it and we'll say, oh, those Africans, that's what they do, when in fact there'll be a pretty straightforward political, economic explanation for it. And of course, there's the combination that we had in the 1930s, where a terrorist who has ideas about the unequal access to resources, the unfairness of the world, actually gets state power with an idea of how that unequal access, how that state of the world could be changed. That's the scenario with Hitler. And the reason fundamentally why I think that this moment is coming more and more to resemble that one is that we really are in an ecological panic. We don't know when it's coming, but we know that it's coming. We haven't yet drawn the conclusion from this that we ought to be drawing, which has to do with science. And so long as we don't draw that conclusion, we're leaving open a gaping possibility for political solutions, for territorial solutions, and therefore for genocidal solutions. Thank you very much.
thank you again to Timothy Snyder. We have a little bit of time now for questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please come line up in the aisle. We have two microphones, one on each side.
Yes.
Oh, and can I? So I have a little paranoid East European proviso. Could you please identify yourself, and could you please formulate your question as a question? Not just you personally, sir.
Yes.
In general.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
My name is Gian Balsamo. Professor Snyder, this was an amazing lecture. 1 month ago, I wouldn't have asked the question. But 1 month ago, my movement, I'm the local representative of the Movimento 5 Stelle in Italy, hadn't received, didn't get such a result in the election, so nobody expected Berlusconi to do. As some said, the two clowns won. The justification of Beppe Grillo is that he does stand-up comedy as a profession. I wouldn't have asked this question because your conclusion about ecology is very inspiring. The problem is that millions of people in Greece and Europe do not have the food, as we know. And history, the history that you have so beautifully described in your lecture, history at times tends to repeat itself, and contrary to what Marx said, I don't think it's always a comedy. Many people think in Greece and in Italy that their sovereignty is eroded by sovereign debt. I wish I had your expertise because I'm spending part of my days trying to bridle this beast that has come out unexpectedly from the past. And I wish if you could improvise a different conclusion to your lecture.
Well, it seems like a very friendly question. Rather than try to, so to be perfectly serious, I am convinced of the conclusion of my lecture. I'm convinced that the examples that you cite are unfortunately, and one could mention others in Europe itself, are unfortunately just little hints of what's possible. So let me just try to make a couple of remarks in response. The first is that let me try to fix a couple of modern or contemporary problems of sovereignty, because my argument here has to do with the relationship between sovereignty and ecological panic. Those are my only two factors really in this argument: destruction of sovereignty and ecological panic. Today, our problems with sovereignty are different, and a couple of them are relevant to the crises you're describing. The first is that the European Union is in a kind of untenable position in its development. Sovereignty has been pooled sufficiently so that national politicians can blame everything on Brussels, but not sufficiently that Brussels is actually responsible. And we are now in this kind of cycle where national politics, not only in Greece and Italy, but in Hungary, increasingly in Poland, has become this kind of call and response, where domestic politics is about symbolism because the claim is that the important things are being decided somewhere else. And I think this has a kind of toxicity to it. And obviously, to my mind, the only way to solve it is to leap forward, but I don't see how that's going to happen. The second issue of sovereignty you named yourself, and it's relevant to Greece. I mean, the one reason for the Greek crisis, which the American press doesn't really like to cite, is the problem of taxation, right? Taxing the people in Greece who actually could afford to pay taxes, who tend not to pay taxes, which is not just a Greek problem. It's not just an American problem. It's an international problem. The problem of how you actually reassess and reevaluate wealth in this kind of globalization such that states can function has become a universal problem, and I think one that has to be addressed as such. I can't revise my conclusion on the basis of those findings, though, I'm afraid, because they only support it.
In your opinion, what was the role of religion in causing the Holocaust?
Yeah. So The question was, what is the role of religion in causing the Holocaust? I think it comes in three ways, but none of them are as straightforward as Catholics killed and Protestants didn't, or Orthodox killed and Catholics didn't. You search in vain for that kind of correlation. There isn't really that kind of correlation. It comes in most fundamentally in one of the places where I think traditional Christian anti-Semitism contributes to Hitler's worldview, and that is the idea, which was implicit in what I was saying, that the Jews are everywhere. That's a Christian idea, unfortunately. That Jews are everywhere, they're around the world, they're more or less equally distributed, and therefore they could have power everywhere. That's one part of Hitler's anti-Semitism, which for the most part is not Christian in origin, which comes from Christianity. Another way that anti-Semitism or Christianity, religion, contributes to the Holocaust is the way that I tried to describe in a positive way. People who had commitments to religion which were not political or not compromised by politics or which were not official actually tended to rescue, not in huge numbers, but much more often than others, right? Which suggests that the problem was not religion, but the official character of religion. It was very easy to get inside official churches, but Seventh-day Adventists or Methodists in Ukraine, some Greek Catholics in Galicia actually rescued the people who themselves had been outside of the state and therefore were much less affected by the process of state destruction, right? Because they were already living in exile from politics. Those people tended to rescue, which suggests to me that the problem was something like official religion rather than religion. The third way the religion comes into it is at a stage in the Holocaust, which I didn't have time to go into at all, but it's in that period which I was describing, that conception of the dark market. After the Jews had been sent to the death facilities, we're in Poland, so they've been sent to Treblinka or Belzec or Sobibor, you have several 100,000 Jews who are still in the cities or in the countryside. And the Poles who are in the countryside are making certain kinds of calculations, as I tried to describe. You know, the penalty for holding a Jew, for saving a Jew, or even for helping a Jew is death in principle. You have to take that into account. You have to take into account that whatever property the Jews have and they offer you is void. You know, if you take it, you're doing something legal. But if you give a service to a Jew in exchange for it, you're doing something illegal. And you have to take into account that your neighbors know all of this. So if they know that you're saving a Jew, they can turn you in, they can get the Jew's property, and they can get your property, right? So the incentive structure for your neighbors is horrifying for you. Where Christian anti-Semitism comes into this, I'm convinced, is that, and there's some evidence for this, is that one of the things which the Poles said, the Poles who did rescue Jews said in the countryside was, I was more afraid of him because I knew he listened to the sermons of our priest, right? And the idea that Jews are Bolsheviks and Bolsheviks are Jews, this Judeo-Bolshevik idea, had become fairly widespread, sadly, from the pulpits of Catholic churches across Europe, Spain, France, Italy, and Poland. And I think you can now begin to see how this mattered, not so much because individual Poles turned Jews away, but because individual Poles thought, I think my neighbor is anti-Semitic, and therefore that's one more risk for me, and that makes it that much harder for me to try to carry this out. So those are the three ways that come to mind. Thanks.
Well, thank you for having us all think about the causes of this beyond matters of individual character or personality or anything, the larger systemic implications. And where I'm still puzzled is the infectiousness of the movement. Mm-hmm. I understand, and here in this bubble of prosperity, it's hard to imagine living in a state of statelessness and hunger because we have so much and we're so secure. But it's still hard to imagine, even with the incentive structure you imagined, mm-hmm. why this caught on so well. Why did it go viral in today's terms when it bumps up against so many previously held moral doctrines?
Yeah. So let me give you a qualifier before I give you an answer. The qualifier is we have to remember that not everyone who's taking part in this total event that we call the Holocaust is thinking, I'm taking part in the Holocaust, is thinking 70 years from now, people have a name for this. It will be regarded as the worst event in human history. I'm taking part in a small part of that. They're very often thinking, I'm killing this Jew, or I'm not helping this Jew, or I'm killing these Jews. And very often the people who have done that, who are doing that, I mentioned the Einsatzgruppen. It's not that the Einsatzgruppen just killed Jews. The Einsatzgruppen killed communists. They killed all sorts of other people. It's not like the Polish police just hunted down Jews in the countryside. They hunted down Polish partisans and they shot and killed them too. So from the point of view of each individual, killing the Jews is not just this thing that I'm talking about, and this thing that we tend to sometimes to more than we should extract from its own setting. That's my qualifier. I'm still going to try to answer your question. The thing that I've been drawn to in trying to explain what I take to be a still unexplained event is the significance of institutions as embodying and as enforcing what you're calling moral norms. It is very, very hard for moral norms to function without some authority behind them. And the pioneering character of German power in Eastern Europe, it was different in the West, and that's why the Holocaust was different in the West, I'm coming to understand was the total destruction of existing institutions, removing what would have been the normal ways that we're virtuous, right? So for you and me, who don't know each other, a normal way that we'd be virtuous with each other is that if we had a contract, we'd fulfill it, right? If I hired you to do something or vice versa, we'd fulfill it. We wouldn't think about it. We wouldn't even think of it as virtue. But the moment that the civil code goes away, the moment there are no police who are going to enforce that contract, how am I going to trust you? How are you going to trust me? And it's a very short step away from that to my thinking, well, rather than doing a deal with this guy, I should just, I'll take what he has, right? And so getting the institutions out of the way does away with this is a kind of empirical finding for me at this point, does away with a lot of what you're considering to be moral. And the people who do behave morally, goes back to the answer to this gentleman's question. The people who do behave morally, interestingly, are the ones who were least implicated in the previous institutional structure. The people who, the Mennonites or the Baptists in Ukraine who had been a minority under the Russian Empire and then were oppressed by Stalin, et cetera, and who hid their own identity, who kind of identified with the Jews for that reason, who interestingly enough thought that the Holocaust was the apocalypse, which is an entirely, it's kind of interesting. They identified with the Jews because they identified with an entire Old Testament version of history, which again is not so unfamiliar to our own country. But the people who behaved in a way that you would call morally tended to be outsiders. Either as individuals they were outsiders, or they belonged to groups that were outsiders. And so, unfortunately, the finding is that if you can knock over the big institutions at the top, you can flip morality pretty quickly. And within Germany, if anything, it's darker than this, because within Germany itself, and this is a point that I spend a lot of time on in Bloodlands, within Germany itself, or for that matter within the Soviet Union, the things that we regard as being horrifying were regarded not just as a means to an end, they were regarded as being moral, right? So Himmler has a morality. Himmler thinks that it's good to kill, this is a famous horrible speech he gives in 1943, it's good to see hundreds of corpses spread out before you because that is your sacrifice. You've sacrificed yourself for the good of the community. This is something that you have done which is actually good. Hitler has a morality as well. The idea, National Socialism doesn't succeed because it does away with morality. It succeeds because it provides an alternative morality, which I'm not going to go into all of its details, but it's not that morality goes away, it's that another morality comes in Germany, and then in these other places where institutions are destroyed, you clear out all kinds of space for people to behave in ways which they wouldn't have behaved in otherwise, right? When the state comes back, they don't behave in the same way. They go back to behaving like they did in the 1930s. We'll take one more from the side then.
My name is Ted Horowitz. So to continue on that thought, from everything that you're reading within it, people within the structure wouldn't necessarily think of themselves as immoral or the definition of, a silly word like evil. That there's a context that this would happen with, that this was, these people are stateless, that this is inevitable. I'm reminded of Elie Wiesel, who was saying what was worse, killing in hate or not killing in hate. So I've always been curious about that. From when you're reading, did the people at the time, not in some sense, say this can't be right, or no, that there was a release of it, and that there is no longer a moral connection? Because if that's the case, the implications of it for humanity are pretty sad.
Well, you can read the implications both ways. You can say that one of the remarkable thing about us is that Hitler's description of us is wrong, that in fact we not only can we create institutions, we do create institutions all the time that go beyond our animalistic side, and that we are capable of thinking of ourselves in ways which are not by analogy with the struggle for survival in the natural world. And that we come equipped with this capacity to do things in twos and threes and in larger groups, and even with the capacity to identify with lots of people that we haven't seen, and even with the capacity to do deals with people we don't know personally, right? So one can read it the other way. One can say, the fact that destroying institutions leads to the possibility of such horror means that our ability as humans to create institutions is something we ought not to take for granted, right? And we ought not to take in successful, prosperous societies like ours, the tendency is to take institutions that were created by previous generations for granted, and to say, well, we could do without this. Why don't we just experiment with that? So it brings one to a kind of conservatism, in fact, that institutions themselves are sort of interesting. It's interesting that we can make them. And they may be much closer to the center of moral life than we usually think. That the center of moral life might have more to do with the reciprocity. Like, this is an institution. A lecture is an institution. You know what to do. I know what to do. We're doing it. We don't have to think about it. There's nothing exaltedly moral about that. But there's something certainly better than you and I fighting about our different views. And it's a simple point. It's not a dramatic point, but it is sort of the optimistic view of your question. What people felt as they were doing these things. Some people certainly thought that they were doing right. Some people certainly, it depends on who. I mean, the striking thing, and one of the arguments I was trying to make in this lecture, the striking thing is the worldview that I'm describing is Hitler's. It's Hitler's. In this way, the lecture was very old-fashioned. I'm not claiming that this worldview was held by that many people, and it really wasn't. Even Heydrich and Himmler didn't believe in it. Goebbels probably did, but Heydrich and Himmler, although they were functionally and no doubt by conviction anti-Semites in all kinds of ways, they didn't have this total metaphysical, ecological view that Hitler has. And so the remarkable thing is that this idea could nevertheless, be the idea that ends up being decisive. And that requires so much explanation that I think it requires more explanation than we have, and therefore the addition of this factor of the destruction of institutions. But as to what people were feeling, the truly dangerous thing, and here I have to close agreeing with your pessimism, is that you can come to doing these deeds from so many different places, and you can think about why you're doing it in so many different ways. And human creativity, which I think resides chiefly in our ability to rationalize post facto what we've already done, is just as effective when we kill people as when we don't kill people.
If you can take one more question.
Okay, let's take these two more, and then I really got to stop. I'm going to take them together, so please, sir.
I want to thank you for both your analysis and synthesis going forward. The image you created towards the completion of your presentation on the impact of global change on food sources and the institutional consequences of that, I think is a story that needs to be more widely told and appreciated in terms of as we move forward with climate change and get closer to a tipping point, how do we get more traction in our political institutions, our media, our public awareness? Because otherwise we're pretty much on the skids to hit that tipping point.
Okay, I'm going to answer this. I just want to take the two of them together so I don't talk too much. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Wendy Kahn, and I read this morning. There's a new book out about FDR and what anti-Semite he was,
poor FDR.
And that he knew about the final solution a long time before the American people. I want to know your comment, what your reaction is.
Okay, I'm going to take. I'm going to group these questions. So with FDR, the way I would answer that is to shift things a bit. So, I mean, on the question of the American people in 1935, 36, 37, 38 were both far more anti-Semitic than we are now, and then we would like to remember, and far, far less inclined to fight the Germans for any reason. But pretty much the last reason the American people would have given, with the exception of the Jews, of course, would have given for going to Europe and fighting and dying would have been to save the Jews. And this means that FDR was in the same position as political leaders who otherwise were very different. Stalin, Churchill, and for that matter, the Polish government in exile. All of them faced the problem that Hitler was saying, this war is a war, remember the beginning of the lecture, this war is a war for, that's what Hitler's saying, it's a war against the Jews, and if you're fighting against me, then you're with the Jews. You are the Jews or you're their puppets. And that's what German propaganda says the whole war through. It's rather effective in Britain and the United States and in the Soviet Union, and therefore all of the leaders of those countries had to do their best to make sure the war was not being perceived as a war that was for the Jews. So there were certainly things that could have been done in the U.S. that were not done. The State Department is a bigger culprit than FDR himself. We could have admitted lots of people that we didn't admit. That story is straightforward. We would feel better about ourselves now, although it wouldn't have made any difference to the Holocaust if we had bombed Auschwitz, which we were technically capable of doing since we did bomb Monowitz, which was part of the Auschwitz. We'd feel better about ourselves. It wouldn't have made any difference. But my main answer to your question is that it's hard for me to imagine another political leader in those times and places who actually would have gotten us into that war at all. So if we want to take any credit for what we did in that war, we have to start with giving credit to FDR and then move on from there to critique. Yeah, on this question, yes. I completely agree. And I completely agree, but I'm not, insofar as I'm in a position to do anything about this, it's by trying to make the point that I made at the very beginning, that history is not commemoration. History is about making sense of the past in such a way that the present and maybe even the future starts to come a little bit clearer. And so the book that I'm writing presents exactly in these same stages the argument. The first chapter is about ecology, the second chapter is about state destruction, the third chapter reposes the question about rescue, and the fourth question is about the future. And I want to try very hard not to abuse the past to put it in the service of the future, because then you're not doing history. But I think if you get the explanation of the past right, if it's an explanation rather than just a portrayal or just a commemoration, then that might help us a little bit, right? Because if there is a consensus in the culture about the thing we should remember from history, it's the Holocaust or something like the Holocaust. But if history means not just remembering but understanding, as I truly believe it does, that might give us a little bit of a nudge towards thinking more proactively about the things, and I agree with you, the things that are now coming towards us and making the future something, very, very quickly making the future something that it wasn't. Thank you.